Hello, welcome to another edition of our virtual Sunday School class. Today's lesson is entitled Preserving Love, and it's for May the 14th, 2017, Spring Quarter Lesson number 11, and it's taken from Jonah, the second chapter, the entire chapter, verses 1 through 10. Now, starting off, Jonah 2, 1 through 10, it reads, When Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered to me out of the belly of Sheol. I cried, and you heard my voice. Now, real quickly to remind us of the situation that Jonah finds himself in, the Lord had sent him to Nineveh to preach repentance to the people of Nineveh. And we find that Jonah had decided not to obey the Lord and to flee in the opposite direction by boat. Now, this may be, as some speculate, that it was out of fear. It may be because Jonah, being a prophet, knew the damage that these people would do to his kinsmen. But regardless, he was being sent by God, and he opted for turning away and going in the opposite direction. And while he was in the boat, a huge storm arose, and the sailors, against their natural inclination, had thrown Jonah overboard, and a fish had swallowed Jonah. And this is the point at which Jonah, that we pick up the story. Jonah is in the belly of the fish, or the whale, and we read in the second chapter, first through second verse, Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me out of the belly of Sheol. I cried, and you heard my voice. Now, I think just about every Christian at one time or the other has found themselves in a very bad predicament. Now, it may be a predicament that our actions have gotten us into. It may be because we have backslid on God and turned our back to God and got ourselves in a horrible state. It could be situations where through no fault of our own, maybe somebody else had done something and triggered us being in this horrible state. But the important thing for all of us to always remember is that when we find ourselves in these terrible states, that we ask the Lord for help. And also, too, we want to make note of how that Jonah said, he said, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, or out of the belly of the grave. And he considered this spot. Now, we don't know if Jonah actually died in that belly of the whale, or if he just was metaphorically using those terms. But he felt like he was in the most dire straits possible in the belly of the whale. Now, going down to the third verse, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me, and all your waves and your billows passed over me. So we see in this condition that Brother Jonah is in, how that he is being completely submerged in the depths of the sea as he is in the belly of this whale. How that he is in an impossible situation, probably the worst situation that if Jonah if he had stayed alive throughout those 3 days, which I believe he had, if he was still alive through those 3 days, that is about the worst condition of anybody, any story that you could ever imagine. Now, I do realize that there have been some stories going around that indicate that there have been people who have been swallowed by whales and then regurgitated or rescued from them. But research indicates, as these stories have been investigated, even though some of them have even been reproduced inside of Bible commentaries, research seems to indicate that those are false stories. And from everything that I can tell from my limited research I did on the internet this week, it does not seem that there have ever been any cases of someone being swallowed by a great fish or a whale and ever being rescued, with the exception of Brother Jonah. And we know that with God all things are possible. And so we know that this was a miraculous deliverance that was on the edge of Jonah's life, as God was going to rescue him from the belly of the whale. Just as miraculously as when Lazarus was told, Lazarus, come forth, and he came out of the grave. Just as miraculous as the widow's son who was resurrected and came back to life when Jesus called him back into life. Just as miraculous as when the prophet and the widow's son in the Old Testament, where that widow's son was brought back to life. Just as miraculous as when the body was fallen upon either Elijah or Elisha, I can't remember which one right now, but the dead body fell on them and came back to life. See, we serve a miraculous God, and it is nothing for him to perform these tremendous miracles, and this is the kind of deliverance that Jonah is about ready to have here. Okay, going down to the 4th verse. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. And we see how that Brother Jonah is in so much despair because he's been driven away. His fellowship had been broken from God. He's been driven away from God's sight. But he expresses faith. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. And he had faith that his prayer was going to be answered. Then down to the 5th verse. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. And you can just imagine how the seaweed and everything was in that whale's body or that fish's body, whichever one. And how that the weeds, these seaweed, had wrapped around Brother Jonah's head. Okay? First part of the 6th verse said, "At the roots of the mountains I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever." So we see that Jonah felt, as he was praying this prayer, he was feeling like he was under he was the lowest of the low. He had been drugged to the lowest point that he possibly could be drugged to. Okay? Going down to the last part of the 6th verse, and through the 9th verse, those read, "Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord." And those of us who have turned our backs on God from time to time, as I have before, and went into a backslidden state and found ourselves to be in such a bad spot, and turned our hearts to God, and know how thankful you are when God hears you and He forgives you and your life is being restored, and how thankful you are when that happens. The times that I have backslidden on God over the last 40-something years, and when the times I backslidden and I have turned my face back to Him and He has restored me, it makes you so very, very thankful. I've been so very, very thankful that we serve a God of a second chance, a God of a third chance, a God of a fourth chance, a God of a fifth chance. And He remembers our frame, and He knows that we're nothing but dust. And when we turn our hearts back to Him and ask for forgiveness and restoration, and we are fully intending to make a change, it's not just words, but there's actions going behind that God hears and answers our prayer and restores us to a place of fellowship. Now, maybe you have lived a perfect life and never dropped the ball, but I haven't lived a perfect life. I have dropped the ball. And let me tell you something. One of the things that I am most thankful for with every ounce of my being, one of the things I am most thankful for is those times when I turned my heart back to God and I turned from my evil ways and I pleaded and begged with God with tears and remorse and regret, and by changing the actions that I have done, and when He hears me and He restores me to a place of fellowship. That is one of the most thrilling things in the universe. It fills you with so much thanksgiving. And that is the feeling that Jonah had. And notice that Jonah let the Lord know that he understood that the Lord's commands must be made. He ended this prayer with, "What I have vowed, I will pay. Now, you get, sometimes people will have these jailhouse confessions, jailhouse repentance, and jailhouse conversions, and it's really only to get them out of the mess they got themselves in, and they had no intention of having a changed way once they get out. Once the problem is alleviated, they go on and do whatever they normally want to do. That's not the kind of prayer that we're talking about that Jonah had, and the kind of prayer that we have to have when we make things right with God. Jonah was completely convinced that this is the Lord's world, this is His universe, and our only option is to say yes, sir, to the Lord and go do what He wants us to do. And Jonah, after he spent 3 days in the belly of that animal, after Jonah spent 3 days in there, he was 100% convinced that this is the Lord's universe, it's His world, and his only option is to say, yes, sir, and go do what the Lord said. Okay, going down to the 10th verse, where the Lord hears the prayer and restores Jonah to the world. Now, whether or not He resurrected Jonah or brought him back to life, or whether or not Jonah was still fermenting inside that whale's belly, I have no earthly idea for sure. I have an opinion. I think Jonah was still alive, but that's just my opinion. But nonetheless, when Jonah prayed and was convinced that he was going to do what the Lord said to do, then the Lord spoke to the fish, and the fish did exactly what the Lord said to do. Jonah 2:10, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Well, friends, look for us on YouTube for next week's lesson next Saturday.